The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer at 0200 hours. Mercy General's ICU stretched across the third floor like a cathedral to suffering, 12 beds, 3 ventilators, and 1 nurse who moved through it all as if the beeping monitors were a language only she understood. Danielle Ross didn't look up from her charting. She never looked up. The pen in her hand moved with surgical precision, each notation exact, each vital sign recorded to the decimal point. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame built for endurance rather than comfort, the fabric whispering against her skin as she shifted from one patient to the next. The night shift at Mercy General was a rhythm she'd chosen deliberately. Fewer doctors. Fewer questions. Just her and the machines and the sound of oxygen flowing through tubes like mechanical breathing. She'd spent 15 years learning how to read bodies in crisis, in desert tents, in Black Hawk helicopters, in places that no longer had names on any map. 2 years ago, she'd walked away from all of it. The promotions, the medals, the weight of command, she'd left them all in a box that she didn't open anymore. Savannah was supposed to be quiet. Coastal. The kind of place where nobody asked where you'd been or why your hands moved the way they did when a patient's oxygen dropped. She reached for her stethoscope at 0207 hours, pulling open the door of her locker. For a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone to truly see, but long enough for the wrong person to notice, a pair of worn combat boots sat in the shadows at the bottom. The leather was creased with memory. The laces were frayed from knots tied in the dark. The boots had walked through Marjah's dust, through blood that wasn't hers, through things she didn't talk about. She closed the locker door. Fast. The sound was barely a click. Danielle's left hand tremored slightly as she reached for the stethoscope. It always did around 0200 hours. The tremor steadied the moment her fingers touched the cold metal of the earpieces. Muscle memory. That's what her therapist called it. Her body remembering what her mind was trying to forget. A faint scar ran along her left forearm, a line of pale tissue that spoke of shrapnel and field medicine and decisions made in seconds. She always wore long sleeves. Always. Even in Savannah's humid summers, the sleeves came down to her wrists. She moved to bed 7, Mr. Chen, post-op cardiac bypass, stable but not sleeping. The monitors showed what she already knew: heart rate 67, oxygen saturation 98, blood pressure holding at 118/72. Everything was numbers. Everything was data. Pain was information. She'd learned that in Kandahar. The body told you things if you knew how to listen. She placed the stethoscope to his chest, listening to the hiss of air moving through lungs that the surgeons had cut open 20 hours ago. His eyes fluttered. He was awake. Sinus rhythm, she said softly. Everything's tracking as expected. He nodded, relief visible in the muscle of his jaw. People always relaxed when they knew someone was paying attention. She'd held lives together with less than attention. She'd held lives together with nothing but steady hands and the refusal to panic. Mr. Chen didn't need to know that. Nobody at Mercy General needed to know that. The charting took another 40 minutes. Danielle recorded every number, every observation, every minute detail with the precision that came from 17 years of documentation in military hospitals where one mistake could mean a court-martial or a body bag. The notations were meticulous. Almost too meticulous. The kind of charting that stood out. The kind of charting that caught attention. Dr. Marcus Sterling noticed it at 02 for 8 hours. He came into the ICU with a kind of presence that made the air pressure change, not because he commanded respect, but because everyone around him suddenly understood what it meant to be small. 6'3", tailored suit that cost more than Danielle made in 2 weeks, a watch that caught the fluorescent light like a signal flare. His name tag read Dr. M. Sterling, Chief of Procurement and Strategic Medical Affairs. The title was deliberately vague. The authority was not. Sterling sat at the nursing station without asking, opening the digital charts with credentials that should have limited his access. His eyes moved across the screen with mechanical efficiency. Supply orders. Equipment requisitions. Phantom purchases filtering through Mercy General's system like water through a sieve. He'd been careful, meticulous. $40,000 a month in equipment that was never delivered, routed through a medical supply company in Arlington that barely existed. Respirators, monitoring equipment, dialysis machines. All coded, all documented, all funneling toward accounts that bore no relation to Mercy General's actual inventory. But Danielle Ross's charting was different. Her notations about equipment status were so precise, so relentlessly accurate, that she'd accidentally flagged discrepancies. Not intentionally. Not with any knowledge of what she was uncovering. But the simple act of recording that a $12,000 ventilator wasn't in its usual location, that serial number tracking didn't match procurement records, that the numbers on the intake manifests didn't align with the numbers on the equipment, those tiny, meticulous notations had created a trail. A map. Evidence. Sterling pulled up her profile on the system. Danielle Ross. Night shift ICU. 12 years at Mercy General. No disciplinary history. No complaints. Quiet. Efficient. Invisible. Perfect. The kind of person nobody noticed because she didn't make them notice her. He made a note on his phone, her name highlighted in red. Then he made a second note, higher. Because people like Danielle Ross, people who paid attention to detail, people who documented everything with surgical precision, those people were liabilities. And liabilities had to be managed. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming. Danielle finished her charting at 0330 hours and moved to bed 9, where Mr. Yamamoto's blood pressure had drifted slightly lower than optimal. Not alarming. Not yet. But worth monitoring. She adjusted the fall rate by 0.2 milliliters per hour, the kind of minute correction that only someone trained in critical care would catch. She stayed with him for 7 minutes, watching the monitor until the pressure climbed back to 116/70. Stable. Everything was stable. Sterling waited until she was back at the nursing station. She was refiling the chart for bed 9 when he approached, his presence arriving a full second before his voice did. The air around him seemed to press inward. Danielle. Not Ms. Ross. Not Nurse Ross. Just the first name, the way men like Sterling used first names with women like her, casual, diminishing, designed to establish hierarchy. Your charting is exceptional. She didn't look up from the chart. Thank you, Doctor. Detail-oriented work, he continued, settling into the chair beside her. The kind of work that requires, let's say, precision. Attention to things that might not be relevant. Her pen kept moving. The notation stayed steady. I document what I observe. Of course you do. Sterling's voice had the texture of a smile that wasn't showing on his face. A voice like a tank idling in a garage, controlled, dangerous, patient. Tell me something, Danielle. When you notice discrepancies in equipment tracking, what do you do? I note them in the record. And you don't wonder about them. She finished the notation and closed the chart. It's not my job to wonder about inventory. Sterling stood, buttoning his suit jacket with fingers that looked like they'd never done actual work. That's where you might be wrong. At Mercy General, everyone's job is to wonder. To question. To make sure nothing gets missed. He paused. Starting next week, I want you to take the day shift. Better pay. Better hours. Better visibility. She looked up then. Just for a moment. His eyes were the color of winter sky, bright, empty, cold. She'd seen that color before, in the eyes of men who were comfortable with certain kinds of violence. The kind that didn't leave marks. I prefer the night shift, Doctor. I didn't ask what you preferred. He walked toward the exit, then turned back. 1 week, Danielle. Let's see if you can handle the pressure of working with more scrutiny. See if you're really cut out for this level of responsibility. The door to the ICU hissed shut behind him. The monitor for bed 7 beeped once. The ventilator in bed 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Everything continued exactly as it had been, except that Danielle Ross had just been marked as a problem. She knew this because she recognized the pattern. It was the same pattern she'd seen in military hospitals when someone in supply got too curious about where the money was actually going. She looked back at the charts, at her own meticulous notations, at the trail she'd created without meaning to. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to what was coming. She had been invisible for 2 years. She'd chosen silence because silence was safer. Silence meant nobody asked questions. Silence meant nobody knew. But silence also meant that when someone like Sterling decided you were a threat, you had nothing to stand on but your composure and the muscle memory that had kept you alive in Marjah. Danielle Ross had survived things that would have broken most people. She'd carried wounded men through kill zones. She'd decided which lives got priority in triage when there weren't enough hands. She'd done things that she couldn't talk about, that she wouldn't talk about, that she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. She could handle Dr. Marcus Sterling and whatever campaign he was about to launch. But the truth was something she'd learned a long time ago: the worst battles weren't the ones you could see coming. They were the ones that started with a man in an expensive suit using your first name like a weapon. She returned to the charting. The monitors beeped. The machines hummed. The night shift continued. What happened next would unfold across 7 days, and by the end of it, everything Danielle Ross had built, the anonymity, the quiet, the safety of being nobody, would burn. But that was still a week away. Tonight, she was just a nurse. Tonight, she was invisible. The fluorescent lights didn't care either way. They just kept buzzing, indifferent to the gravity well that had just formed in the night shift ICU at Mercy General in Savannah. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent frequency as Danielle moved through the morning shift change at Mercy General. The nurses' station smelled of stale coffee and the particular staleness that accumulated in air-conditioned spaces where exhaustion pooled like water. She was updating a patient's medication log when Sterling's voice cut through the ambient chatter, loud enough for the entire unit to hear. "I'm giving the new girl 1 week," he announced, gesturing toward her with theatrical disdain. "She's got that broken look. They always quit." Danielle's hand stilled over the keyboard. Around her, 7 nurses exchanged the kind of glances that came from watching dominance displays unfold. She took one measured breath through her nose, the kind that steadied diaphragms and cleared vision. When she looked up, one tear tracked silently down her face, not from pain, but from the sheer weight of restraint, the pressure of holding herself intact when every nerve wanted to respond. "I've survived worse countdowns, doctor," she said, her voice level as a surgical drape. She didn't raise it. She didn't inflect it with anger. The flatness of it was somehow more devastating than any outburst could have been. Sterling's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected a response at all, let alone one delivered with such quiet certainty. He turned away, muttering something about documentation errors, but not before writing on the whiteboard visible to every staff member, "Ross termination pool, 7 days." Beneath it, he drew a countdown clock, crude but unmistakable. The cafeteria assault came 3 hours later during the lunch rush. The space was packed, 40 staff members minimum, the kind of audience a bully needed like oxygen. Danielle sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating something that probably tasted like cardboard. Her hands were steady. They had held bleeding men through minefields, they could hold a plastic fork through a cafeteria humiliation. Sterling approached from behind, made deliberate eye contact with the surrounding tables, and knocked her lunch tray to the floor. The coffee splashed her white scrubs. The plate shattered. Scattered laughter rippled through the room, not from cruelty but from the infectious nature of social pressure, the way humans laughed at spectacles they witnessed but didn't initiate. Danielle stood slowly. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of movement that came from training where wasted motion meant wasted blood. She crouched and began gathering the broken ceramic pieces with meticulous care, one shard at a time, stacking them in neat order. One tear tracked down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand. "I've cleaned blood off men I carried," she said quietly, looking at no one in particular. "This is just lighter weight." She found a trash bin, disposed of the pieces, and walked out of the cafeteria with her head level. No stumble. No tremor in her shoulders. The room's laughter died before she reached the doors. But that wasn't the worst part. The shift change came at 1,600 hours, when the ICU corridor filled with overlapping staff, shift reports being called out, medications being verified, the controlled chaos of transition between teams. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look like wax and exhaustion look like a chronic disease. Sterling had timed it perfectly. He cornered her near the supply room, patient chart in hand. When she looked up, he threw it directly at her feet. Papers scattered across the linoleum like shot birds. Patient demographics, lab values, medication orders, all of it spreading in a debris pattern that said this wasn't an accident. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying enough to reach the nurse's station 30 feet away. "Or is bending over too complex for you?" The word landed like a blade. Not because of what it meant, sweetheart, diminutive, dismissive, but because of the deliberate cruelty underneath it. He was testing her. Watching to see if she would break, cry, snap back, do anything that would give him justification. Danielle crouched without responding. Her hands moved with the same precision they'd used to tie tourniquet knots on limbs that were already mostly gone. She gathered every page. She organized them by patient number. She stood and handed him the reassembled chart with her eyes meeting his for exactly 3 seconds. "I've carried wounded men through minefields," she said, and her voice had dropped an octave since the cafeteria. Something in it had changed, some underlying frequency that suggested the performance of compliance was becoming something harder, something with more weight behind it. "Your cruelty weighs nothing." He called her sweetheart twice more that week. Wednesday morning outside a patient's room. Thursday afternoon in the medication dispensary. Each time, she absorbed it with a kind of quiet dignity that somehow made him angrier than if she'd fought back. Her composure was a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw reflected in it. By Friday, Sterling was in his office making calls. His network was extensive, 3 board members who owed him favors, the hospital's risk management director, a psychiatrist he consulted regularly on liability cases. He began planting seeds with the precision of someone who understood institutional machinery. Psychological concerns. Questionable judgment. Erratic behavior patterns. He mentioned the possibility of PTSD complications, unstable former military cases, the liability nightmare of an employee who might have untreated trauma. What he didn't mention was the chart she'd flagged that had exposed his $40,000 monthly phantom equipment scheme, the reason he needed her gone before she noticed anything else. The emergency transfer arrived at 02 for 5 hours on a Saturday morning. Sergeant Tyler Ames, 82nd Airborne, 27 years old, admitted via helicopter from a training accident at nearby Fort Stewart. Penetrating chest trauma, left anterior thorax, estimated blood loss already critical. The trauma surgeon wasn't available. It was Sterling's turn to cover emergencies, and when he reviewed the incoming notes, his expression shifted into something that looked almost like professional focus. Danielle was called to assist in OR 3. The space hummed with organized urgency, the ventilator waiting, the surgical trays laid out like surgical chess pieces, the lights positioned to eliminate every shadow. Sterling moved with competence when his pride wasn't involved. He was actually a good surgeon, which made him a more dangerous man. "Primary repair of lung laceration," he said, scanning the imaging. "Get me 8 to 0 proline and suction." Danielle moved with her own precision. She was a step behind him in terms of credentials but several universes ahead of him in terms of what her hands had learned to do under pressure. Her fingers worked with the kind of economy that came from field medicine, no motion wasted, every movement counted twice. When Sterling finished the main vessel repair, she was already positioning for the secondary bleeders. She tied off the lacerated Brandt vessel with a specific triple knot configuration, a technique developed in dusty places where surgical supplies ran out and bleeding didn't stop. The knot had a particular architecture: wrap, cross, cinch, secondary reinforcement. It was faster than traditional suturing and held under conditions that would make standard knots slip. Ames was semi-conscious under local blocks for the chest work, his awareness drifting in and out like fog over water. His eyes focused on her hands as she worked. She could feel his attention like weight. "That's a Marjah stitch," he whispered, his voice thick with the sedation cocktail running through his full line. His hand moved, instinctive, dangerous, near the surgical field. "Where do you serve, Chief?" The room went dead silent. Danielle's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. That was the tell, that microsecond of hesitation that said his observation had hit something true. Her jaw tightened. When she resumed working, her movements were slightly faster, as if precision required her undivided attention. "You're confused, Sergeant," she said, keeping her voice in the neutral register of professional nursing. "Hold still." But Ames kept staring at her hands, even as the anesthesia pulled him deeper. His eyes tracked her movements like he was trying to solve a puzzle that only her fingers could answer. "Only SF medics tie it that way," he whispered, his voice slurring into something almost dreaming. "I know you. I've seen you." "Which team?" She didn't answer. She worked. Sterling watched this entire exchange with the expression of a predator recognizing an opportunity. After they closed him, after they wheeled Ames to post-op recovery, Sterling cornered her in the surgical scrub area. The space smelled of soap and old copper from where equipment had been cleaned. The fluorescent lights cast his expression in stark detail. "Military background," he said, not as a question. As a threat wearing the shape of an observation. "Unstable PTSD cases are liability nightmares. The hospital requires disclosure of all mental health complications. I'll be making calls to your references." "I disclosed everything required during hiring," Danielle said, removing her surgical mask with movements that were all efficiency. No emotion. Just fact. "We'll see what your references have to say about everything," Sterling replied, and she could hear him already composing the narrative in his mind. Erratic behavior. Combat-related trauma. Possible substance abuse patterns typical of PTSD cases. Risky judgment in high-stress situations. Just enough ambiguity to create doubt. He immediately contacted her references, civilian hospitalists who knew her work but not her history, people who would be confused by calls about psychiatric instability. He brought in the hospital's risk management director, Dr. Patricia Reeves, a woman who understood liability better than human beings. "The Marjah stitch is concerning," he told her in his office, the door closed, his tone the very picture of professional concern. "It's not in any standard surgical curriculum. Suggests either extraordinary training or behavioral patterns that might indicate foreign military experience." Without full disclosure. "She disclosed military service at hire," Reeves interrupted, reviewing Danielle's file. "Did she?" Sterling leaned back in his chair. "Or did she disclose the service in the military, which isn't the same thing as disclosing combat deployment to active conflict zones, trauma exposure, potential PTSD complications?" It was a technical knife, accurate enough to sound legitimate, strategic enough to create reasonable doubt. Ames was moved to her ICU for recovery at 0630 that morning, still groggy, still watching her hands whenever she checked his vitals. His eyes would track her movements like they were reading a language only he could understand. By Monday morning, Sterling had scheduled an official meeting with hospital investigators for exactly 3 days out. Wednesday. 72 hours. He had planted the seeds and set the timeline, and now he was watching to see what would grow. Danielle worked her shifts with the same quiet competence that had defined her since she arrived at Mercy General. But something had shifted. Her voice had dropped another half octave. The way she moved through the hospital had changed, no longer deferential, but not yet openly commanding. Something in between, something that suggested the mask was beginning to fracture along its edges, and whatever lay underneath was considerably harder than what everyone had been seeing. The monitors began their descent at 3 in the morning. Danielle was checking Sergeant James Ames's vitals when she noticed the first irregularity, heart rate dropping from 82 to 74 in a matter of minutes. Not unusual for sleep. She would have dismissed it except his blood pressure was dropping too. 88/56. then 82/48. The numbers were sliding downward like a patient losing altitude, and every nerve in her body recognized the pattern. She pulled the chair closer to his bed and watched the monitor. 68 beats per minute. The rhythm was sinus but ineffective. His heart was working, but something was preventing the blood from actually moving through his body. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality that made her jaw tighten. Danielle had seen this exact presentation in Marjah, in Kandahar, in places whose names still belonged to classified briefings. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space around the heart like fluid in a cup, compressing the organ, strangling it. She placed her stethoscope against his chest. The heart sounds were muffled, distant, as if his own heart was speaking to her through water. His oxygen saturation was already dropping, 94%, 92%, 89%. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, working harder to compensate for a cardiovascular system that was collapsing. Ames's eyes were still closed, but his face had begun to show the signs of cerebral hypoperfusion, the subtle slackness that came when the brain stopped receiving adequate blood flow. Danielle moved with the fluid precision of someone whose training had made crisis response a language more fluent than words. She didn't reach for the phone to call a code. She reached for the portable ultrasound machine that lived in the corner of the ICU, the one marked for emergency use, the one that required authorization from attending staff to deploy. She wheeled it to his bedside and pressed the transducer against his sternum, angling it downward toward the pericardial sac. The image appeared on the screen. Black meant fluid. The space around Ames's heart was completely black. 120 ccs of blood, maybe more, compressed inside the tough fibrous membrane that enclosed the organ. Each time his heart tried to contract, it was working against that pressure, pushing against walls that had become a cage. His heart could not fill. Could not work. Could not save him. Danielle's fingers moved across the machine's controls with the muscle memory of 18 years of field medicine, 18 years of making decisions in desert tents and transport helicopters and the backs of hums where the boundary between life and death measured in milliliters. She marked the fluid collection, noted its depth, mapped the safest approach. Between the 5th and 6th ribs. Just lateral of the left midclavicular line. A spinal needle. In and out. Drain the fluid. Give the heart room to beat. She was reaching for the needle when Sterling appeared in the doorway. He was still in yesterday's clothes, dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, tie loosened but still hanging around his neck. His hair showed the pattern of having been slept on. He'd come straight from home, probably still half asleep, responding to the automated alert that one of his patients was decompensating. His eyes moved from Ames to the ultrasound screen to Danielle's hands, and she watched the calculation happen behind them, the moment he understood what was about to occur and decided that his interests took precedence over the patient's survival. "What are you doing?" His voice carried the particular edge of someone waking to a threat. "Cardiac tamponade." Danielle didn't look at him. She was prepping the needle, laying out the supplies with the economical precision of someone who had performed this procedure under fire. Pericardiocentesis. Now. Absolutely not. Sterling crossed the room in 3 strides and positioned himself between her and Ames. "You are not authorized for invasive procedures, Nurse Ross. Step back or I'll have security remove you from this room." Ames's oxygen saturation hit 86%. Then 84. His lips were beginning to show the cyanotic tint of profound hypoxia, the bluish cast that meant his tissues were starving. His pupils were dilating. The monitors showed a heart rate of 48, a rhythm that was losing its urgency because the organ itself was beginning to fail under the pressure. "Then you do it, doctor." Danielle's voice didn't change. She didn't raise it, didn't harden it, didn't add a single decibel of emotion. She simply stated a fact: you perform the procedure. Sterling's hands were shaking. Not from the adrenaline of the crisis, from the recognition of what he could not do. He had trained in emergency medicine 18 years ago, before the kickback schemes had started, before the phantom equipment orders had become his primary occupation, before his hands had forgotten how to work under pressure. His fingers trembled as he reached for the ultrasound probe, and she saw him realize in real time that the trembling was visible, that she was watching him fail. 30 seconds. The silence of the ICU was absolute except for the ventilator and the monitors, except for Ames's oxygen saturation declining toward the red zone. 79%. 76%. Danielle moved. She pivoted left, slipped past Sterling with the kind of fluid economy of motion that comes from having spent years navigating tight spaces in hostile territory. His arm came up to block her path, but she was already past it, already at Ames's bedside, already positioning the ultrasound transducer against his chest wall to guide the needle. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain. She simply worked, her hand steadier than the cardiac monitor's rhythm, her breathing measured and controlled, her entire body operating on the frequency of a threat she had been trained to neutralize. The needle was 14 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac, sharp enough to penetrate the fibrous membrane in a single smooth motion. She felt the slight resistance as it passed through the layer of tissue, then the absence of resistance as it entered the fluid-filled space. Her hands guided it by ultrasound, watching the needle tip on the screen, positioning it for maximum drainage, minimum risk. Behind her, Sterling's phone was out. She heard the mechanical click of the camera opening. She heard him recording. Heard him say with a voice designed to be heard clearly in a deposition, "Let the record show that Nurse Ross is performing an unauthorized invasive procedure against direct orders from the attending physician." The first syringe filled with blood, dark blood, nearly black, the kind that meant it had been sitting inside Ames's pericardium long enough to partially coagulate. 30 ccs. She withdrew the syringe, connected another, and drew again. 60 ccs. 90 ccs. 120 ccs. Ames gasped. His entire body convulsed upward as if someone had run electricity through him, the gasp of a drowning man breaking the surface, the convulsion of a nervous system suddenly flooded with oxygen after minutes of deprivation. The monitors responded before his eyes opened. Heart rate climbing, 62, 74, 86, 98. Blood pressure rising, 76/38, 84/42, 92/54, 102/60. Oxygen saturation, 84, 91, 96, 99. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful sinus rhythm. The kind of normal heartbeat that meant the cardiac tamponade had been relieved, meant the heart had room to work again, meant a human being had been pulled back from the threshold. Ames's eyes opened. They moved from the ceiling to Danielle's face, and she saw something like recognition pass through them, not confusion, not gratitude, but understanding. His lips moved. His voice was barely audible, a whisper that came from somewhere deep and old and certain. "Marjah," he breathed. "You were in Marjah." It wasn't a question. Sterling's phone was still recording. His expression had shifted from fury to something more calculating, more predatory. He lowered the phone slowly, his eyes moving between Danielle and Ames, his face settling into the particular stillness of someone who had just captured the final piece of evidence he needed. He had documentation now. He had a procedure performed outside scope. He had a patient recognition that could be weaponized into psychiatric allegations. He had everything. But what he didn't have was a patient who was dead. Dawn broke gray across Savannah, the kind of morning that felt like a warning. Dr. Sterling sat in his office before 6, before the fluorescent lights fully buzzed to life, before anyone else arrived. His tie hung loose around his neck. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, not from fear, but from the pure crystalline certainty of a man whose world had just shifted. The pericardiocentesis had changed everything. Not for Sergeant Ames, whose vitals now climbed toward stable. For Sterling. That procedure, performed without his authorization, performed by a nurse in an ICU, was his opening. His weapon. He'd seen her hands move with too much precision, seen the ultrasound guidance she used like she'd done it 100 times before, and he knew. Something about this woman was wrong. Something about her was dangerous. He dialed the first board member at 5:33 a.m. The voice on the other end was groggy, irritated, then suddenly attentive. "Daniel, it's Piers Sterling from Mercy General. We have a psychiatric emergency on staff that requires board-level intervention. One of our nurses experienced a complete break during a patient crisis. She performed unauthorized procedures. Dangerous procedures. We're talking about someone who believes she's still in combat." He paused, letting that land. "I have documentation. Erratic behavior. Insubordination. Clear signs of acute psychotic episodes." The board member listened. Sterling could hear the concern settling in like fog. He hung up and dialed the second board member. Then the third. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, 3 different people at 3 different levels of hospital administration had heard the word psychiatric, had heard the word dangerous, and had heard his voice, steady, professional, alarmed, painting a portrait of a nurse whose mind had fractured under pressure. At 7:15 a.m., Sterling composed an email to the hospital's investigation department. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd done this before, doctored a narrative, shaped a story, bent the truth until it became a different shape entirely. He quoted things Danielle had never said. He described behaviors he'd never witnessed. He attached timestamps to incidents that never happened. By 7:32 a.m., he'd sent it. The email landed in the inbox of Gerald Hutchins, the hospital's director of employee relations, a man who'd spent 15 years protecting Mercy General from liability and who trusted Dr. Sterling implicitly. Sterling had treated his daughter's appendicitis 2 years ago. Sterling had a reputation. A track record. An air of competence that made people believe him. At 8:10 a.m., Sterling made a call to the State Nursing Board's disciplinary hotline. He left a voicemail, his voice lowered, concerned, the voice of a senior physician with genuine professional worry. "I need to report serious concerns about the mental fitness of a nurse currently employed at Mercy General. Her name is Danielle Ross. She's demonstrating signs of what appear to be PTSD or acute stress disorder. She performed an unauthorized medical procedure on a patient yesterday, a procedure that, while it technically may have been medically sound, was performed without oversight and raises serious questions about her judgment and her mental state." By 10 a.m., the cascade had begun. An email arrived at Danielle's work inbox. "Please report to Human Resources immediately. Do not return to patient care." She was in the ICU. She didn't see the email until 10:02 a.m., when her charge nurse told her to step away from the monitors. Danielle's hands had been steady throughout the morning, checking Ames's cardiac output, adjusting his for rate, ensuring the pericardial fluid didn't reaccumulate. The work was everything. The work was the only thing that made sense. The walk to Human Resources took 4 minutes. She knew this walk would change things. She'd spent enough time around men like Sterling to recognize the pattern, the power grab, the narrative control, the way institutional systems could be weaponized like any other tool. 3 people sat across from her in the conference room: Gerald Hutchins from Employee Relations, Dr. Catherine Moore from Medical Affairs, and a woman she didn't recognize who introduced herself as Dr. Lisa Chen from the Psychiatric Consultation Team. Hutchins didn't look at her directly. "We've received serious concerns about your conduct during yesterday's emergency. Specifically, the pericardiocentesis you performed without physician oversight. The patient was in cardiac tamponade," Danielle said, her voice level. Dr. Sterling was frozen. The ETA for cardiothoracic was 17 minutes. The patient would have been dead in less than 10. "That may be," Dr. Moore said carefully, "but the protocol is consultation before independent action." "The protocol is saving lives," Danielle said. Still level. Still controlled. But something had shifted in her tone. It had hardened, become flatter, like steel settling into place. Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Ms. Ross, I'd like to ask you some questions about your overall mental state. Dr. Sterling has expressed concern that you may have experienced some kind of acute stress response yesterday." "My mental state is fine. You performed a high-risk procedure," Chen continued, her pen hovering over her notepad. "You acted independently. You didn't consult your supervising physician. These can be signs of impulsive decision-making, possible mania or... The patient was dying. Danielle's eyes moved to Dr. Chen's, and something in that contact made Chen pause. I saved his life. That's what nurses do. But the narrative was already written. The documentation was already filed. Sterling's emails had arrived first, had shaped the initial response, had primed the system to see Danielle's actions not as heroism but as pathology. Hutchins cleared his throat. Effective immediately, you are being terminated for gross insubordination, unauthorized practice beyond your scope, and demonstrated psychiatric unfitness to practice nursing. You will be escorted to your locker to collect your belongings. Your badge will be confiscated. You are not to return to patient care areas without explicit written permission from hospital administration. Do you understand? Danielle said nothing. She stood. She walked. The security officer, a young man named Deshawn who'd always been kind to her, barely met her eyes as he walked her to the ICU locker room. He stood in the corner while she opened her locker, while she pulled out her personal items, while she reached for the pair of combat boots at the very back. The leather was worn soft with time and use. The soles were creased from 1,000 miles of walking. They still held faint traces of dust from the Helmand province. Dust that was 15 years old. Dust that would never completely wash out. She held them against her chest like they were made of something breakable. I'm sorry, Chief, Deshawn said quietly. Danielle turned to look at him. His eyes widened. Something in her face, maybe the way the light fell, maybe the way her posture had shifted without her noticing, made him step back. I'm going on break, she said, and walked past him out of the hospital. The parking lot was grey and empty. Her car was in the same spot it had been for the past 14 hours. She threw the box into the back seat without looking at it. She drove home without seeing the roads. Her apartment was quiet in that particular way that apartment buildings are quiet on weekday afternoons. She parked. She climbed the stairs. She unlocked the door. Emma was at the kitchen table. She was 7 years old and she should have been in school, but it was a teacher workday and her grandmother had forgotten, and Emma had called the school's emergency contact line, and the school had called Danielle, and Danielle's sister had gotten there at 2 p.m. to stay with her. Her sister had taken one look at the text from Mercy General's HR department about the disciplinary meeting and had quietly excused herself to make phone calls. Now Emma looked up from her coloring book and saw her mother standing in the doorway in scrubs that had dried blood on the sleeve from last night's emergency. Dried blood that wasn't hers. Danielle still hadn't changed. Mommy. Emma's voice was small. Why are you home? Danielle couldn't answer. She couldn't explain. She walked to the table and sat down across from her daughter. The combat boot slipped from her grip and fell to the linoleum floor with a soft thud. Emma stared at them. What are those? Something I carried, Danielle said, her voice breaking in a way she hadn't expected. A long time ago. Are they? Are you sad about them? Danielle felt the tears before she expected them. Years of holding them back, of maintaining composure, of being the person who didn't break, suddenly breaking. Not in front of the hospital. Not in front of Sterling. But here, at her kitchen table, in front of the only person who didn't have an agenda or a narrative or a need to win. Emma stood up on her chair and hugged her, her small arms around Danielle's neck. Mommy, why are you home when people need you? And Danielle realized that Emma was right. That this, the sitting down, the breaking down, the loss of position and title and the hospital floor meant that somewhere in Mercy General, Sergeant Ames was waking up without his medical support. Somewhere in the ICU, there was no one checking his cardiac output, no one watching for the fluid that might reaccumulate, no one with her training and her experience standing between him and complications. She'd been fired for saving a life. At that same moment, 3 miles away in his office at Mercy General, Ames made a phone call. His voice was hoarse but steady. He had the number memorized from before deployment. His commanding officer picked up on the second ring. Sir, I need you to find someone for me, Ames said. A senior chief. Danielle Ross. She was in the ICU. They fired her. For saving my life. I need you to find her. The commanding officer, Colonel James Mercer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a man with 32 years of service and a memory that could hold faces and names across decades, went very still. What was that name? Mercer said. Ross. Danielle Ross. She knew Marjah. She did a pericardiocentesis on me when my heart was drowning in blood, and she knew exactly how to do it, sir, and they fired her for it. Mercer hung up and made 3 phone calls. Within an hour, a dozen more calls went out across Special Forces networks. Names that hadn't been spoken in years. Call signs and identities and the kind of quiet reputation that travels through communities of professionals who understand what it means to be good at what you do. Someone called the FBI. Agents who'd been quietly investigating Mercy General's billing systems for 6 weeks, phantom equipment orders, false vendor accounts, the steady siphoning of money that added up to $480,000 annually, suddenly had new interest. Falsified psychiatric reports about a staff member. Reports filed to justify termination. Reports that might constitute evidence tampering. And at 6:27 p.m., as the sun fell below the horizon and the parking lot lights flickered on in the color of old sodium, Dr. Sterling sat at his desk completing the final incident report. He was being thorough. Meticulous. He was documenting her erratic behavior, her signs of acute psychiatric distress, her dangerous independent actions. He was building a case that would hold up to any review, would protect him from any liability, would ensure that no one ever questioned his narrative. That was when the windows began to rattle. Not from wind. From something deeper. Something rhythmic and vast and growing louder. Sterling looked up from his desk. The pane shook. His coffee mug trembled across the surface toward the edge. In the parking lot below, the sodium lights flickered across something dark and massive rolling forward in geometric formation. 6 transport trucks. 2 Hums. 100 Special Forces operators in full dress uniform, boots hitting pavement in synchronized thunder that made the hospital building vibrate. Sterling stood. His hands, which had been so steady that morning, began to shake. Danielle sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot with cardboard boxes stacked on the passenger seat, each one holding 18 years of her life in miniature, a stethoscope she'd bought in 2006, the coffee mug from her first shift, a photograph of her daughter's kindergarten graduation. The rain hammered the windshield like gunfire, and she didn't wipe it away. 3 days. That's how long it took for Dr. Sterling's fabricated psychiatric reports to move through the hospital's bureaucracy, for her termination to become official, for the woman she'd spent 2 years building, quiet, compliant, invisible, to collapse entirely. She stared at the building's entrance, at the sliding glass doors that had been her world, and realized she was holding her breath. Not from fear. From the practiced stillness of someone who'd learned that movement draws attention, that sound draws fire. Her hands lay flat against the steering wheel, steady as they'd always been, and she pressed her palms down until she felt the calluses, the ones Sergeant Ames had recognized in surgery, the ones that marked her as something other than what she'd pretended to be. The parking lot was still except for the rain when the administrator's car lurched into the nearest space, tires squealing. He sprinted toward her, waving. Behind him, the doors to Mercy General swung open, and a man in dress blue stepped through, not a hospital employee, not hospital security. A colonel. His uniform carried the weight of command the way Sterling's never would, his posture the architecture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Behind him came more uniforms. Then more. Danielle's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The trembling wasn't fear, it was recognition, it was the muscle memory of every briefing she'd ever received, every moment she'd thought she'd left behind. The colonel moved across the parking lot with the deliberate pace of a man executing an operation, rain soaking his shoulders without him noticing. He reached her car window, and she rolled it down slowly. The smell of wet diesel and rain-soaked wool filled the cabin. His voice, when he spoke, carried the cadence of someone reading from a carefully memorized script. "We're here for Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross." Not a question. Not a request. A declaration. The words landed like ballast, heavy and final, and Danielle felt something in her chest shift, the architecture of her hiding place finally, irrevocably, cracking open. Inside the lobby, Emma stood trembling in her striped candy striper uniform, her 15-year-old frame too small for the weight of what she was holding. The Navy file lay open in her hands, and she was reading the words slowly, as if pronouncing them might make them real. Mom's a senior chief. The liaison officer beside her, a SEAL team leader with a scar that traced from his left temple to his jaw like a map of survival, stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was steady as bedrock, 2 Navy crosses. The file turned a page. Emma's eyes widened. For bronze stars. Another page. The words kept coming, each one a brick in a wall of evidence that her mother was not, had never been, the quiet ICU nurse who brought home exhaustion and stitched her own wounds. Silver Star. Extraction of 12 wounded combatants from Marjah under sustained fire. The SEAL team leader moved closer, his presence making the air pressure change, his uniform somehow more real in this fluorescent-lit corridor than it should have been. She saved my life twice. Twice, and never said a word. Emma looked at the photograph on the file's first page, a younger woman in combat fatigues, eyes like tempered steel, hand steady on an M4 carbide. Then she looked toward the lobby entrance where her mother stood flanked by operators in full dress uniform, and the boots in Emma's hands, the pair her mother had kept in her locker, worn leather and scuffed toes and the ghost of red dirt that would never quite wash out, suddenly made terrible sense. The FBI agents moved with the precision of people who'd practiced this moment. One of them stepped directly in front of Dr. Sterling as he tried to retreat toward his office, Miranda rights crisp as a new uniform. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs made a sound like a key turning in a lock, sharp, definitive, the sound of a door closing that would not open again. Sterling's face had gone the color of old snow. Around him, the staff he'd bullied for years stood motionless, watching. The agents escorted him through the lobby, past the 100 Special Forces operators who stood in perfect formation, and every officer's eyes tracked him. Not angry. Not vengeful. Simply witnessing. The psychiatric reports were spread across a conference table upstairs, Sterling's careful forged documentation, his deliberate falsification of a federal service member's medical record, his attempt to obstruct what was already a Navy investigation into his supply company kickbacks. The prosecutors would later describe it as consciousness of guilt so obvious it seemed almost intentional. The fabricated reports about Danielle's instability, her supposed psychiatric episodes, her unfitness for duty, all of it designed to discredit her if she ever testified about the phantom equipment orders, about the $40,000 monthly transfers that had been flowing into accounts Sterling controlled, offshore companies with single-letter names. But he'd made one critical error. Danielle Ross was on inactive military status. That made the false reports not just hospital misconduct. That made them federal crime. That made them obstruction of a military investigation. That made them the final domino required to collapse his entire house of cards. Danielle stood in the center of the Mercy General lobby surrounded by 100 warriors in dress uniform, and the woman who'd walked in 3 days ago to turn in her locker was unrecognizable, or rather, the woman who'd arrived 18 months ago pretending to be someone she wasn't was finally, mercifully, extinct. Her daughter pressed against her left side, still holding the combat boots, and the SEAL team leader who'd been saved twice stood at her right shoulder. The officers formed ranks around her like a formation, like a salute made of flesh and presence. Her new uniform, the formal dress blues that someone had brought from wherever they'd come from, fit her shoulders as if they'd been tailored for exactly this moment. The hospital administrator stood speechless, watching the woman he'd fired become something he'd never possessed the authority to remove, and somewhere in a holding cell, Dr. Sterling was beginning to understand the actual scope of the charges the federal prosecutors were about to file. 6 counts of falsifying federal medical records. 2 counts of obstruction of justice. Financial fraud totaling $2.3 million in phantom equipment orders. The supply company he'd partnered with, the one that had sent men with a knife into Mercy General's parking lot at 0200 to intimidate the nurse who'd flagged the discrepancies, was rolling on him, offering testimony in exchange for reduced charges. Sterling's own lawyer had stopped taking his calls. The hospital board was already issuing a statement distancing themselves from his conduct. The network that had protected him, that had made him powerful, was evaporating like rain on hot asphalt, leaving him visible in a way he'd never been before, naked as a body stripped of uniform, which was the only kind of exposure that mattered. Emma looked up at her mother's face, truly looked at her for the first time in 18 months, and saw the military-grade composure falling away like a mask no longer required. Danielle's jaw unclenched. Her shoulders, which had been held in the careful defeat of a woman pretending to be smaller than she was, squared. Her eyes, which had learned to avoid contact, lifted to meet her daughter's, and there was such devastation in them, such tenderness, such the weight of decisions made in darkness that the girl finally understood her mother hadn't been weak. She'd been hiding. And the cost of that hiding, the bruises on her ribs from the men with the knife in the parking lot, the stitches she'd sewn in a bathroom stall at 0230, the files Sterling had weaponized to destroy her, the 3 days of sitting at their kitchen table staring at the floor while her daughter asked why someone would hurt Mommy, all of it had been the price of remaining invisible to a man who couldn't see strength unless it was violent, unless it was loud, unless it was his. One of the operators stepped forward, and Danielle recognized him immediately, the paramedic from Marjah, the one who'd taken shrapnel when she'd gone back for him, the one she'd carried 2 miles through combat before a helicopter came. His salute was sharp as a knife strike. Her hand rose to her forehead in the same motion, years of muscle memory executing perfectly, and the lobby went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, could hear the helicopter rotors in the distance, could hear the sound of one closed chapter giving way to the beginning of another, to the possibility that a woman might finally be allowed to be seen for exactly what she'd always been, a warrior, a healer, a mother, a hero wrapped in scrubs and silence, finally permitted to take off the mask and breathe. If you enjoyed this story of hidden courage and reclaimed truth, please subscribe for more stories about the strength that lives in quiet people, the honor that transcends uniforms, and the reckoning that comes when the world finally understands what it's been standing next to all along. Like this video, leave a comment sharing your own story of being underestimated or of discovering that someone you thought you knew held secrets far greater than you imagined. And if you know someone who's carried invisible scars, please share this with them, because they need to know the world is ready to see you now.